Coming up on this episode of the Metal Command podcast, Dave Mustaine has decided to re-record the Metallica classic Ride the Lightning, which is a song that he helped co-write. I talk about two brand new albums and review two records that I think are absolutely outstanding. One would be Coroner with the album Dissonance Theory and Testament with their brand new album Parabellum. And we here on the Metal Command podcast pay tribute to the late, great Ace Frehley from Kiss, who sadly passed away recently. All of that coming up next here on the Metal Command podcast.
You are listening to the Metal Command podcast.
Greetings and welcome back to another edition of the Metal Command podcast. Tony here with you. Always excited to see everybody here today. And of course, if you do like what you see and hear on this program, please by all means hit the subscribe button here on the channel. Hit that little bell to be notified anytime I do post any kind of content. And if you follow this show on any other form of social media or streaming service, please by all means give the show a like and a follow there. And of course, like the video, comment on the video. I'm interested to hear what you think about what is going to be discussed here today on this show. So folks, I've been gone for a little bit, and part of the reason is that I got to be honest with you, the weather change here in Ohio hit pretty hard as far as the temperature drop, and that always, every year, basically makes me lose my voice. So I lost my voice to the point where I really couldn't do an entire episode or even an entire segment. And now I have my voice back, so I'm able to do this. It's part of the reason why I was gone for as long as I was. And I have a lot of great content coming up for you. And I have to get started with some of these album reviews. So the two albums I'm going to talk about today is the new Coroner album, Dissonance Theory, first album by Coroner in, about 30 years, basically, a little over 30 years now. The new Testament album, Parabellum, which I think is outstanding. I'm going to talk a lot about that. I'm going to also talk about Dave Mustaine making the decision to re-record the song Ride the Lightning by Metallica. But first, I want to talk about the late, great Ace Frehley from Kiss, who sadly recently passed away. This was something I wanted to talk about shortly after it happened, but of course, me not really having much of a voice, I really couldn't do that. However, I want to talk about Ace, and the reason I'm going to talk about Ace Frehley here to start the show, this is a very influential guy on so many people that have decided to pick up a guitar and start playing and basically become a musician. I think 95% of the bands I've ever interviewed, and pretty much all of the bands I know personally, whether they are extremely successful and well-known, or bands that have more or less like a cult following, I would say almost all of them, especially the guitar players, will tell you that a guy like Ace Frehley and his onstage persona and his playing style influenced them to go out, pick up a guitar, and start playing. I would say 95% of the people that I know that are in bands who are very, very successful picked up a guitar for the first time and started playing because of Ace Frehley, the spaceman, and the onstage persona he brought out on stage that had such a huge positive impact on so many people. For example, as many of you know, Halloween is a great example of, a band that had an influence from Kiss. If you talk to Andy Darris, he will flat out tell you Kiss was pretty much one of, if not the band that really inspired him to become a musician. The first ever interview that I did with him back in 1998, I said to him, what bands really influenced you? And the first band he named without hesitation was Kiss. Huge influence on him. Huge influence on a lot of other people that I know. Huge influence on a lot of bands I've run into. I remember when Ace passed away, I can't even tell you the amount of text messages I received from people in bands that I know. But this man had a profound influence on people. And if his guitar playing really didn't influence somebody, like, as far as like his actual playing, his on-stage persona and what he brought on stage with a larger-than-life band like Kiss influenced a lot of these people to want to become a musician. Interestingly enough, I have a couple stories in regards to Kiss, in regards to Ace. So the first ever arena show that I've ever watched. Now, I had been to some big outdoor shows. I had been to a lot of shows that were small clubs when I was in high school, but I had never seen any band in an actual arena. And on July 20th, 1996, I was able to go to a Kiss concert here in Cleveland, Ohio, at what was known as Gund Arena, which is now known as Quicken Loans Arena downtown. And here, I'm going to show you. Here's my tour book for that concert, 1996-97. This was definitely a tour book I purchased. Now, back then, I had just graduated high school, so I really could barely afford tickets to this thing. I believe we ended up getting nosebleed seats, and actually, it was kind of cool because you could see the whole stage from up top in these seats and see pretty much everything. You know, if you were on the floor, you probably didn't really take in a lot of the stuff going on stage, but from the seats that we had, because that's all we could afford as high school kids, you could see a lot on stage. And I was blown away by that show. And to give you an even better story, I really didn't know much about Kiss at all. Some friends of mine convinced me to go. My first Kiss album didn't even have Ace on it. It was the album Revenge, because that's what came out when I ended up getting into the band. And I really hadn't explored them yet. I knew some of the songs that were played on the radio, but I really hadn't explored their music yet. So I went into the show not owning any of the albums from the songs that they played live. So this show, when I saw it for the first time, actually seeing this, I was completely blown away. First of all, when we walked into the arena, the amount of people in Kiss costumes and Kiss makeup I had never seen anything like that before in my life. I had never seen anything like this in my life in person. The fan base for this band was absolutely incredible. One of the greatest fan bases of any band I have ever seen in person. Some of these people, their costumes looked incredibly authentic. And the makeup. I mean, there were people that I would see them walk in. I'm like, man, is that Gene? Like, literally, you would look at these people and think, man, they really did an incredible job looking like the band. The amount of merch that was getting sold at this show was insane. I ended up being able to, I think we walked up to a t-shirt booth and there were like 2 t-shirts left. Luckily, they had my size. The t-shirt has since been worn out and is long gone, but I have the tour book. And I could barely afford the tour book and the t-shirt. Again, I was a high school kid. I was 18. Didn't have a lot of money back then, but man, I have to say, I was totally blown away by seeing this band for the first time. And Ace was incredible on stage. The whole band was really incredible on stage. Peter Criss, Gene Simmons, Paul Stanley. It was a larger-than-life rock show. And it's actually the only time I've ever seen Kiss play a show with Ace in the band. Oddly enough, it's the only time I've ever seen Kiss live. Because again, when they would come play here, schedules wouldn't line up. I wouldn't go. I had to work or whatever the case may be, or I couldn't get off work. However, that show is one that I will never forget. Again, I didn't know the impact this band really... See, back then, I was just maybe 3 or 4 years in when it comes to hard rock and heavy metal music. So I really didn't know a lot of the history either. But I ended up getting a lesson by seeing how many Kiss fans showed up, wearing the makeup, everybody singing the songs. And even though I hadn't heard most of the songs in that set list, I made sure the next day after I went to this show, I saved up as much money as I could and I bought every Kiss album that they had. All from the 70s. Absolutely incredible band live. And that is definitely a show I'll never forget. As far as Ace is concerned, and as far as Kiss is concerned, let me talk about him for a minute. I think the guy was an incredible songwriter and a guitar player. When you listen to those Kiss solo albums that came out back in the late 70s, and I know I'm going to get a lot of flack for this, his solo album, in my opinion, was my favorite. And not only that, but I liked it better than the other three solo albums combined. I mean, the Paul Stanley, Gene Simmons, I could flip a coin as to how much I liked either one of them. The Peter Criss album, probably my least favorite of the four. But the Ace Frehley solo album, for me, personally, is my favorite of those four solo albums. And I remember distinctly first hearing the song Ozone, which is probably still my favorite song off of that album. And then later on, as I ended up getting into this music and I ended up going, doing the radio show, what I used to do is I would always go, I had to play a show. I had to air a couple shows after my show ended. So what I would do is I'd put those shows on the radio. Mind you, this is 1998. There was no streaming. So everything's live in real time there on the radio, but I had some pre-recorded shows that I would play. And what I would do is go back into the radio station record library and just pick random albums by hard rock and heavy metal bands, go into the production room next to the on-air studio, which was at WBWC 88.3, and I would listen to music I had never heard before. And I remember distinctly getting the Frehley's Comet album and seeing that in there. And I'll be honest with you, when it comes to stuff from the 80s, like Kiss, like when you listen to the music that Kiss did in the 80s, I think that Frehley's Comet album was every bit as good as anything Kiss did in the 80s. Albums like Crazy Nights and Lick It Up, and you had Hot in the Shade, Asylum, probably my favorite 80s Kiss album. I think Ace's Frehley's Comet album was every bit as good as what Kiss was doing. It really was. Then, you had Second Sighting, you had Trouble Walking. The newest album that he came out with, the newest solo album, I think it was 2009, was Anomaly, which I think was great. But I really, really liked his solo stuff a lot. And the guy he wasn't a bad singer either. And he was a pretty damn good guitar player. He really was. Now, my biggest regret, and I have this regret in regards to a lot of artists out there. I had a chance to interview Ace Frehley. The interview was offered to me. And there are times where schedules do not line up to where, someone presents, hey, you want to bring this artist on your show, and I can't do it. And that happened. The one opportunity I ever had to really interview Ace Frehley would have been on my radio show. I wasn't able to take that opportunity. The thing that I regret the most about it is that I look back at when that interview was offered to me, and if I really had wanted to put the effort in, I probably could have done it. It would have been a little hard, but I probably could have made it work. And I look back at the 27 years almost 28 years I've done this show, and there are a few artists that I could have talked to, or I could have talked to more, where I regret not being able to talk to them. Like Ronnie James Dio, I was able to interview several times in the early 2000s. And then later on, I would have subsequent opportunities to talk to him on the radio show. And sadly, the schedules didn't line up, but if I really worked at it, I probably could have done it. And so if people always ask you, what is one of the regrets you have about the Metal Command show? And that is probably the only one. Artists I could have spoken to or could have spoken to more, not really putting a little bit more effort into fitting them into my schedule. Nowadays, I try to fit them in my schedule much better than I did back then. But that's the one regret. I would have loved to have interviewed that man. But I think the guy was an incredible guitar player and an incredible influence on this music. I don't think hard rock and heavy metal music would be what it is today if Kiss did not exist, especially what they did in the 70s. Because what they did in the 70s was larger than life. And during that reunion tour with that classic lineup, I was able to witness that at least once in my life. And it's a concert that I will never forget. Anyhow, this is my tribute to Ace Frehley. I would love in the comments to hear what your favorite album or song written by him actually is. And did Ace inspire you? Are you a musician? I would love to hear your stories of your first Kiss concert with him playing, or even seeing him live with Frehley's Comet. I'd be very interested to hear that stuff. I always love to hear people's stories and reactions when they talk about different bands that they've seen live. But Ace was truly a phenomenal character. He was definitely a little bit of a different character than Gene and Paul. And again, it's a very sad day. It was a very sad day when that man passed away, because he really made his mark. And he made his mark more than people think. I didn't even realize. I mean, I knew the guy was influential, but when he passed away, I had so many musicians. My entire timeline was full of Ace Frehley tributes from so many great musicians out there. It really showed what kind of a positive impact this man had on not only a lot of music fans, but many musicians as well. So that's what I have to say. I'd love to hear your comments. What is your favorite Ace solo album? Mine is, of course, the first one, which I ended up getting a really gently used original pressing of that recently. And Godspeed to Ace, the man, just an incredible influence on this type of music. Okay, so speaking of bands that have made a big impact on me recently, we have the new album by Testament. Let's talk about this, because this record really blew me away when I heard it in its entirety. So, as you know on the show, I had gone through the first two singles that they had put out. I talked about the first two singles they put out, which would have been Infanticide, AI, and then, of course, Shadow People. Those, tracks 2 and 3 in the album. And I thought to myself, there's going to be something about this Testament album there's something that felt different about this record. And the first thing I'll say to everybody out there, Testament, like some of these thrash bands or some of these legacy bands, sometimes, one thing they didn't do where a lot of these legacy bands fall into like a rut is making the same album twice or just rehashing old songs. Testament could have easily made another like Titans of Creation or another Brotherhood of the Snake, and I don't think anybody would have been down on them for it. They decided not to do that. Instead, I would argue that this is probably one of the most innovative albums they've ever put out. One of the most incredibly well-written albums that they have ever done. That is, to be honest, this record is one of the best albums Testament has ever put out. Why do I think that? So first of all, there are so many different elements in this album that blew me away. So you have the very beginning of it. So the first song in the album, you have For the Love of Pain. Very good, very heavy song. Goes to kind of like this sort of doom metal interlude in the middle of it. And Chuck Billy's doing, more of his death metal style vocals that that we've heard on other albums before. I mean, he started really doing that on the album Low. Then they had the album Demonic where he did that, on most of the album. But you go from these kind of death vocals to Infanticide AI, which has some black metal elements into it. Then you go to Shadow People, which has this more like groove oriented sound. And you've heard Testament do songs like that. Then you go from those 3 songs where you have these black metal influences and you have some of these death metal influences in the songs to a ballad. Haven't heard Testament do a ballad in a long time. But, on a lot of their albums, they would do one. They did one, on Practice What You Preach, Souls of Black. You had, The Ritual. You had Return to Serenity on that album. You had a ballad on, Low. And anytime Chuck sang any of those songs, and I'm going to get to him in his vocal performance on here in a minute, it showed a different side of his voice. And on this album, not only do you hear the heavy sort of death metal sound of his voice, you hear his regular singing voice, and you hear him singing on a ballad. And I think if I'm going to chalk up what I would consider probably the best vocal performance of the year by anybody, it would be Chuck Billy. Because there were a lot of songs and twists and turns in this album that I was not expecting this record to take. Like the ballad was definitely, and just so you know, the ballad is called Meant to Be. I was not, when I heard this, and I heard Shadow People, I'm like, great, they're probably going to have something heavy come up. And then the ballad shows up, and I'm like, holy crap. Was not expecting that. Definitely not. So I would say that, as always, Testament has always been one of those bands that is just world class in everything that they do as far as music. As far as musically, just a world class band, world class players. Alex Skolnick, again, playing some incredible leads on this album. Eric Peterson, what can I say? Underrated, definitely an underrated guitar player as far as being a rhythm guitar player. I still think that he doesn't get his just dues. Guys like James Hetfield or Scott Ian or, Dave Mustaine. I mean, these guys all get a lot of recognition, but I don't think Eric Peterson gets recognized enough. Here, I'm taking the cellophane off of this album. I have it on vinyl. Most of the vinyl variants are like this copper variant. Many of you who watch the Facebook page probably saw me actually holding up a copy of that. But, I got to be honest. This band really just, man, it's like they always amaze me what they can do. And ever since they came back, so ever since The Gathering was actually the first ever album promoted for radio that I started playing on my show when I started it off as a radio show. I think Spitfire Records put that out way back in the day. But man, I have to say that they've been on a tear when it comes to putting out some incredible albums. I'm just looking at this booklet, while I'm talking here. Just some incredible stuff. Here's another interesting tidbit on this album. And something that people haven't really been talking about as much, but they should talk about this. The new drummer, and excuse me if I mispronounce this man's name, but Chris Dovis. This guy is absolutely incredible. They had Gene Hoglan, who is, again, an absolutely incredible player, fit really well with the music. Chris Dovis, their new drummer, is absolutely incredible, and he is absolutely one of the highlights of this album. This guy feels like he's been playing in Testament for years. That is how good this guy played in this record. I want people to kind of focus on that a little bit, because when you hear this guy play drums, it's incredible. But the album itself, I think, is very, very good. If I were to rank it, when it comes to their albums, and I'm going to get into a few more of the songs here, I like it better than the last album, Titans of Creation. I like it better than Brotherhood of the Snake. I'd say it's probably a top 2 or 3 albums they've ever done. At least for me. So there's the song on, another single. It was High Noon. I'd say of all the singles, it's actually my least favorite song in the album. But you have some great, great stuff on here, on this record. I mean, It's pretty good. Formation of Damnation is one of my favorite albums by the band, most definitely. I would say that, when I look, sorry, I have to do something here. When I look at their discography, Testament is like two different eras. You have the old stuff, like before the 90s. The old stuff, like the first album through Souls of Black. And, you have that all the way through, I would say, The Ritual in the early 90s. Then the 90s came, and you had Low, which I think was an incredible record. Demonic I wasn't as big of a fan of, not because of Chuck's death metal vocals, but mainly because I didn't like the songwriting on it. And then you had The Gathering, which The Gathering still, oh man, it's one of my top, probably in that top 2 or 3. I'd say The Gathering, Parabellum, and Dark Roots of the Earth. Dark Roots of the Earth in this album, for me, they are neck and neck as far as my favorite Testament albums. Now, that's not to knock The New Order or The Legacy or Practice What You Preach. Those are great records. But I really think this Testament album is absolutely incredible from start to finish. Even High Noon, which I would say, in my opinion, is my least favorite song on the album, even that song is very, very good. So, Eliran Kantor, of course, did the artwork. Absolutely incredible artist. He did the Dark Roots of the Earth artwork, which is my favorite cover by him, by the way. He did some of the Halloween covers. He's done a lot of really great album covers. But overall, Parabellum, every aspect of anything Testament has ever done is represented here in some way. And I think that's what makes this album so great. Because I don't think they've ever done a record where they've really had all of those elements, where you have a ballad, where you have Chuck singing, in that type of voice on a song on an album, where you have some of these crazy, unexpected twists and turns. You have on some of these songs, like again, you have a lot of black metal influence. You have some death metal influence in there. You have some of the classic Testament influence in there as far as like what they've done, in the early days. You have a little bit of everything. They didn't just go and rehash Titans of Creation. They didn't just go rehash the Formation of Damnation. They really went and wrote songs that really took some turns I didn't expect. Like when I heard about this album coming out, before I heard any music, I'm thinking, probably going to be another version of a Titans of Creation or Brotherhood of the Snake, which were okay records. They didn't have that much staying power with me. But this album, Parabellum, definitely does. Dark Roots of the Earth definitely had and still has staying power with me. Formation of Damnation, The Gathering. I would say this album is right up there with any of them. And again, world-class performances by every single member of this band. Seriously. It's the song Witch Hunt, I think, is absolutely incredible. Room 117 is absolutely incredible. And honestly, Chris Dovis. Hold on, let me go find this picture in here. There it is. Right here, this guy. This guy's pretty damn good. Obviously, Steve DiGiorgio is an incredible bass player. Definitely, he's been in a lot of great bands over the years as well. So, I highly recommend this album. If you like Testament, if you didn't like the last 2 albums, I'm going to tell you, you should check this one out. Almost everybody loves it that I've seen. But for me, the highlights on the album, Chris Dovis on drums, new member, making his impact. Obviously, everybody's great, and they put on a world-class performance, but I got to give props to the new drummer. The songwriting is definitely not a bunch of tracks they just decided to rehash that sound uninspired. every song in this album, I think, is great. And it just throws you through some twists and turns you don't expect. But anything Testament has ever done on any of their records is definitely well represented on the new album Parabellum. Highly recommend it. Check it out. I'll have a link to where you can go and buy it if you want a physical copy, or even the download for that matter. But definitely highly recommended. And as somebody that has followed Testament since the early 90s, for me, it's in the top 2 or 3 as far as their albums are concerned. Want to hear your comments? What do you think about this new album by Testament? What's your favorite song off of it? Leave them below. Going to go and into the break here. I'm going to go and after this talk. After the break, I'm going to talk about the new Megadeth album, the upcoming Megadeth album, which there is a track list out for. Finally. And, of course, Dave Mustaine talking about re-recording the album, not the album, but the song Ride the Lightning. And I also review the brand new Coroner album, Dissonance Theory. All of that coming up next here on the Metal Command Podcast after this. Tony here from the Metal Command Podcast. Since 1998, I have hosted this show, which started off as a radio show and, of course, is now in the world of podcasting. That's right. I've hosted the show since 1998, and I've had the privilege of speaking to so many great bands and artists over the years, and I appreciate the following and support I am receiving from all of you. The show has definitely grown a lot over the last year, and I would love your support. If you have not yet done it, please hit the subscribe button here on YouTube and follow the show on any other form of social media. Now, back to the second half of this episode. Okay, everybody, welcome back to the Metal Command Podcast here after the break. Tony here with you. Let's get into the next topic of the show. We've had something very controversial happen among the thrash metal fan base. I don't know why it's a big controversy, but a lot of people are making a big deal about this. And that would be Megadeth announcing that they have a bonus track in their album and that they have recorded their own version of Metallica's Ride the Lightning, which obviously appeared on the second Metallica album of the same name. Now, obviously, Dave Mustaine co-wrote that song. He helped write a lot of the early material as well. I believe he wrote parts of Call of Cthulhu. And, of course, he talks about the fact that he wrote parts of Leper Messiah that appeared on Master Puppets. But he has announced that they've re-recorded a version of Ride the Lightning. I want you to watch this video clip really quick. And I want you to hear what he had to say as far as his reasoning why Megadeth decided to do this. Check out this clip.
On the new album, we recorded Ride the Lightning, and the reason we did that was obviously it's the song that I had a lot to do with writing it. And James and I, when we were working on the song, it became clear to me when James first started playing guitar how good of a guitar player he was. And I thought it would be really cool to close the circle, to show respect, to play the songs that I've written with Metallica, and to honor our friendship, even though it's been strained and ruined from emotions over the years when we were not necessarily friendly. But one thing I've always had is I've always had a tremendous respect for James's guitar playing and Lars's songwriting. So it was cool to do this and add it to the record. We sped it up just a little teeny bit, and we kind of played around a little bit with the solo, and Timo and I both tossed it back and forth to each other. So you might hear a little bit of some differences with the tempos, and of course I sing different from James too, but once again it was about completing the circle and just showing what James and I as guitar players did to change the world.
Okay, so that's Dave Mustaine talking about his reason and rationale for re-recording Ride the Lightning and putting it as a bonus track on the new Megadeth album. So a lot of you have messaged me. I've had a lot of emails asking me what I think about this, because obviously many people know I love Megadeth. And I've talked about Megadeth recently because of the new single. First off, let me say this. I'm intrigued. I'm actually kind of surprised. And I'm interested to hear what this is going to sound like. Now, I want to point out, folks, that Mechanics on the first Megadeth album is basically, their version, almost like a different version of the Four Horsemen that appeared in Kill 'Em All. Dave named the song, obviously the name of the song was different and it was arranged differently. But, a lot of the main riffs and a lot of the main parts are there. So they did do this back on the first album. And I have always been on record, and many of you that have followed my show, even back throughout the history of the radio show, remember, I used to always say that so many people, too many people, and so many people in the media, always, in my opinion, have always focused too much on Dave's early years when he was in Metallica, instead of focusing on a lot of the great stuff that he's done musically, with Megadeth. And I've always thought that the Metallica thing has always overshadowed a lot of his musical accomplishments in Megadeth. And I still think that. I still stand by that statement. At the same time, though, when I look at this, I can understand his mentality and why he would be doing something like this. Number one, if this is to be the last Megadeth album, he talks about, you heard that video, he talked about, the friendship that he had with James Hetfield. Now, I don't know what that friendship status is like. It's always hit or miss, in the media when these guys talk about each other. So I don't know what it's like behind the scenes. And the thing is, it doesn't matter. Because back then there was a friendship. They had musical chemistry. And let's be real here. Dave helped create a lot of the early music that Metallica recorded, which ultimately led to their success. So this vibe of what he's talking about pretty much sounds like a celebration of what Dave has done musically over the years and what he did with Metallica. And I have no problem with him celebrating that, or even, re-recording this track to celebrate that, because he should be proud of those accomplishments. And let's say, look, let's say those guys don't like each other. And again, I don't know what their friendship status is. I don't know if these guys talk behind the scenes. I have no idea. I have no idea what goes on in either camp for either one of those bands, for that matter. However, even if let's say Dave Mustaine isn't a fan of James Hetfield, or they really don't like each other anymore, keep in mind, even if you have a falling out with somebody, you could still celebrate the accomplishments that you have had together. I brought this up in a previous episode of the podcast, talking about the John Schaefer, Stu Block thing, right? I was part of a car magazine. In my opinion, I did some incredible work. And everybody else involved in the magazine, including the guy that put the magazine together, they all did some incredible work. And I'm still really proud of what was accomplished. Even though there has been a falling out, even though I left, even though when I left, I will probably tell you it wasn't on the greatest terms. The bottom line is, you can go look back at it, and you could still celebrate it. And I still celebrate it. I still celebrate the work that was done because I'm proud of it. And even if you have a falling out with somebody, I'm proud of what they accomplished with that magazine as well. So I could see where Dave is talking about this when he talks about coming full circle, because he's really talking about what he created with those guys back in the early 80s. And let's be real here. Dave Mustaine wrote a lot of great stuff with Metallica and was a big part of their early success. I'm talking about the music, not just getting signed to a record label, but I'm talking about music that had been written, which really gave Metallica their early success. So I see this as more celebrating a music career. Because if this is going to be his last album, let's say, for example, it is, I'm mostly sure it probably will be, just by the vibe of many of the interviews I've seen Dave, see Dave putting himself in, as far as the interviews I've watched or listened to with Dave and, various media outlets. But it's them celebrating this. Now, to this day, I'm still going to go down. I'll be on my deathbed saying that people talk about Metallica with Dave Mustaine in it way too much, and it overshadows Megadeth. A point that I have always made, and any time I had Dave Mustaine on my radio show, I would really stay away from the Metallica stuff, because it would be the same stories we've all heard for the last 3 or 4 decades, and it gets old after a while. And I've always said it overshadows his musical accomplishments. But I think in this case, being that it's going to be the last Megadeth album, I think Dave really wants to show how proud he really is about stuff that he's done, and he should be. And not only that, but they're even though he talked about it, even though it's been put out there, it's a bonus track. It's not the focus of the album. It's not like it's the first song on the album or the third song on the album. It's basically a bonus track that looks to be listed at the very end of the record. So it's Dave going back to his roots, celebrating what he helped create with guys like Lars Ulrich and James Hetfield. And if you listen to that video, he's very complimentary of those guys. He has a lot of respect for them. And even if you have a falling out with people like that, you can still have a lot of respect for what they do and their ability, in this case, with Metallica, and James Hetfield and Lars, with the ability to help make that band successful and become successful songwriters. So that's how I view that. I'm looking forward to hearing what it's going to sound like. Personally, if Megadeth had come out and said, yeah, we toyed with this, but we weren't going to do it, I'd be a little bit indifferent. I wouldn't really be disappointed. But now that it's out there, I'm really intrigued to hear what this is going to sound like. And it's funny because when I go back to the early days of the band and, listening to Megadeth for the first time and listening to Dave Mustaine sing, I had always wondered, what would it be like if Dave Mustaine recorded a version of himself singing Jump in the Fire or Phantom Lord or something like that. I've always thought that in my mind, especially in the early days, I've always had that thought in my mind. So now it's going to be interesting hearing him sing Ride the Lightning. And it's interesting too, because usually everybody with Dave, they focus on Kill 'Em All. They don't talk about Call of Cthulhu or, Ride the Lightning, even though Dave Mustaine helped co-write a lot of that stuff. You don't really hear people talk about him on those 2 tracks because he was well out of the band by then. So I think it's intriguing. I think it's pretty cool. I think that he should celebrate what he's done musically. It does take a little focus off of Megadeth because you're going back to the Metallica thing again. But at the same time, as a musician, I can completely understand why he would want to celebrate that and come full circle with it. So that's my take on it, folks. That's what I think. I'm curious what you think. Leave a comment. Are you interested in hearing this? Do you think he should just stay away from the Metallica thing? Or are you kind of indifferent to it? I'd love to see your comments. Now let's go to the last segment of this show. I want to talk about Coroner. Brand new album, Dissonance Theory. Folks, when I heard Coroner was coming out with an album, they were recording a record, I was excited. And it felt like an eternity. It felt like this band had been recording this album for a very, very long time because it had been so long since they talked about making new music that I completely forgot that they were going to be putting this album out. But they decided to put the record out. The thing about Coroner is this. They have never put out the same album. Rip is much different than the second album, and those 2 albums are much different than No More Color. Much different than, Mental Vortex and then Grin. All of the albums previous to this have been very, very different from each other in so many ways. Now, my first exposure to Coroner, actually, there's two avenues I went down to get into this band. The first avenue was being a kid, seeing the video of Masked Jackal come on the MTV Headbangers Ball. And that was my first time ever hearing the band. And then in the band Archetype, Chris Matus, the guy, the guitar player, huge Coroner fan. And then once I was talking to Chris about them, when we would talk about influences, that was one of the bands that really influenced him. And I'm like, I got to check this band out now. So this would have been back well after they had been broken up. Then they started to play shows, and I actually interviewed their previous drummer, Marky, I believe is what his name was. He came on my radio show. I'd like to say 2009, 2010. I don't remember how long ago it was, but I do have that interview somewhere. And I was able to interview him, but I remember hearing No More Color and Mental Vortex for the first time, and I immediately loved the band. The first couple albums are okay. They're old. They're older. They're like a lot of your typical older noise record releases. They're kind of underproduced, very unique. You can hear the band's potential. And that would go for any band on noise. Gravedigger was like that. Halloween was like that. Some of the very early Celtic Frost stuff was like that. It was very raw. You could definitely hear that the band was probably going to get better on subsequent albums. And just like many bands that were originally came on noise records, Coroner did. So I was always, of course, intrigued to hear what would Coroner sound like over 30 years later. And here we are, Dissonance Theory. I think this album, I think it's probably their best album, to be honest with you. It's very well refined. It's definitely different than what you hear on the previous 5 studio albums. Of course, they did have that Coroner compilation with some, bonus tracks on it and, tracks from other albums on it. I'm not really going to count that. But I think this album is a lot different. There's a lot of elements of thrash and a lot of groove metal played into it. But what I like about this record is it sort of represents almost everything that they've done. I said this about the Testament album, where they put a record out that really was a good representation of everything that they had done throughout their career. And I think this Coroner album, Dissonance Theory, is the same way. So we had the first single, Renewal, definitely very progressive sounding, had a lot of twists and turns I wasn't expecting. Definitely had the signature Coroner sound, but with a more modern production, because I believe Tommy Vetterli does music production and things of that nature, over in Switzerland. So I thought the sound of the album was incredible. And they really have put out a very good modern day album representing everything they've done. There are some elements on it, some slower parts of the songs that kind of remind me of the album Grin a little bit. But I would probably categorize this record, if I were to probably put a description for somebody that has never heard it but has heard the past Coroner material, it's somewhere between Mental Vortex and Grin. I would probably lean more to the Mental Vortex side of things, but it has some intriguing elements in it. So I'm going to give you some highlights for me as far as this album is concerned. So you have the first album, first song, Consequence. It's a great opener. When I listen to this album, I cannot think of another song that would be a better first track on the album. Interestingly enough, the last song, called Prolonging, was quite intriguing, because one of the things that was intriguing about it is the fact that they have this Hammond organ going while they are playing a Coroner-styled song. And I remember listening to the record. I kind of had it on in the background when I first heard it. And I had to stop. I'm like, what song is that? What is that playing? And it was a distorted Hammond organ. That's what it sounds like. And I thought that was an intriguing element, because it was something that I was definitely not expecting. That's on the very last track of the album. We have the song Renewal. Obviously, we heard that single. Again, I think that's one of the better songs on the album. But the one thing about Coroner that was interesting, and this kind of translated into a lot of the songwriting that Archetype did, because Chris was influenced by them, was they almost write two songs within one song. And if you listen to these tracks, and this is probably the most intriguing thing about this album, is you never really know where these songs are going to go when you first listen to it. You know, a lot of bands, I'll get a lot of these albums that get sent to me. You can pretty much predict, you know, where the song is going to go. This, I could not. And, you know, like I said, Prolonging, you have the Hammond organ in there, which really kind of threw me through a loop. I was not expecting that. And for those of you that are hearing this, I think having that organ in that song makes that song sound really cool and much different. But overall, if you're going to look for songs to listen to, I got them listed here. Consequence is the first song, is definitely one of my favorite ones. Symmetry, I think, is an outstanding track. We have Transparent Edge, which is great, and then Trinity, and then of course the single. So overall, I'm going to be very blunt. This is a candidate for Album of the Year. Ironically, the CD ended up getting delayed for whatever reason. I'm still waiting on my copy. It's going to be coming here sometime in November, but I did get it on vinyl, which was a really cool, kind of like this Coke bottle glass color. And there's a photo of me, obviously, holding it up, you know, on the Facebook page. But generally speaking, when it comes to comeback albums, I'm going to be honest with you. You know, right now, I'd have this album in my top 5 for the year. And it's probably going to be there. It's really that good. Because I have found myself listening to it a lot. You know, like, I'll get a lot of these albums sent to me. And if it's good, great. But there are times where I just don't listen to them until the end of the year when I start reevaluating and listening to everything again. This Corner record I've been listening to this on a regular basis for quite some time. So I think Dissonance Theory is an absolute masterpiece. I think that these guys being back and creating music again, I've always said that they have always been one of the most unique bands in thrash metal. And generally speaking, these thrash metal bands have always been very unique. So I think it's a candidate for Album of the Year. Right now, if I had to make a list, it would definitely be in my top 5. But you definitely need to pick up Dissonance Theory by Coroner. I'll have a link in the show notes to go pick up a copy of that album. And I think it's incredible. And it's definitely worth the 30-plus year wait. Well, folks, that's what I have for you today on the Metal Command podcast. Of course, you can support the show by leaving a comment and obviously hitting that little bell to be notified anytime I do post any comment, and hitting that subscribe button. With that said, thanks for watching. Stay metal. Hey, it's Tony here from the Metal Command Show. I want to thank you for watching this portion of the program. Since 1998, I have hosted the show, which started off as a radio program and is now into the podcast format. So I want to thank you for watching and or listening. And if you want to support the program, hit the subscribe button, hit that little bell to be notified anytime I do post any content. A lot of you have been supporting the show and really, really helping this show grow, and I cannot do it without all of you. So with that said, thanks for watching. Stay metal.